Okay, Stephen, can I just take a question here from Alan Jukes, who's a former finance minister here in Ireland. He wants to know, and this question relates to Africa. He says, what effect does Professor Walt foresee for Africa in what you've been describing there? He says, disruption of trade flows will hamper development processes, and competition from the rest of the world for example, precious metals could lead to further dangers of external manipulation and corruption in African states, I suppose. So the effect on Africa of what we talk about Asia, obviously, to some extent, to a considerable extent, but maybe just a little bit of focus on Africa.
Yes, so with the caveat that I don't consider myself an expert on African politics, and so I don't speak from a deep well of expertise on this one. But I'd say a couple of things, and I agree with the thrust of the question. I mean, first of all, the pandemic is having a very powerful effect in parts of Africa, partly because public health facilities are not as well developed as they are in other parts of the world, with the small caveat that some African countries have responded actually pretty well, in part because they've had experience with things like Ebola and others in the past. And so there was a certain degree of expertise or awareness of how seriously one had to respond. But the rest of the question, I think, gets it exactly right. There are two big issues. One, Africa had been doing relatively well when the rest of the world economy was doing well, for all the obvious reasons. The rising tide was lifting all boats and was lifting Africa actually faster than other parts of the world. If the whole world economy goes back the other direction, this is harmful to Africa, and they don't have the reservoirs of wealth to buttress or to get through it as easily. So if we have a very slow global economic recovery to COVID, that's not going to be good for Africa. Second, to the extent that the United States, China, and perhaps some others start playing hardball with each other and start worrying about relative levels of influence, on the one hand, some countries may be able to play both sides off against each other and benefit from that. But I think if you look at sort of the history of the Cold War, for example, Soviet-American competition in some parts of the world, and including Africa, ultimately wasn't beneficial for those societies, as the question implied. It tempted us to, cut deals with rulers who chose to support us, even if they weren't very good for their own countries. It made us put human rights on the back burner, even economic development on the back burner, to strategic position and competition. And I would worry that we're going to see a replay of things like that in the future if a if a Sino-American competition really heats up. Okay,
Stephen. So a question here from Suzanne Keating, who's the CEO of one of our development agencies here, DOCUS. She says Ireland is due to sit on the Security Council in January 2021, having, of course, been elected as a non-permanent member for the 2 years, 2021 to 2022. She says, given your analysis, what would you advise that they, being we, I suppose, prioritize if we are to have any influence at that table? I mean, maybe.
I obviously, not knowing what the agenda is going to be, it's sort of impossible to answer the question. But I would say to almost any country, as a non-permanent members, to say you should think for yourself. That I think the Security Council works more effectively when the permanent members are not able to fully dictate the outcome of different initiatives or different resolutions, and actually have to go do the real political and diplomatic work of rounding up support. And so, if the United States is able to put together positions that command real support through the Security Council, that's good. And when we find ourselves isolated because the position that we're taking can't even command support from Ireland, that should be a warning sign to the permanent members that maybe that they're off, in a position that's not really defensible. So I guess I would encourage the Irish representative to think for himself or herself.
In this case, it'll be a herself. Stephen, just a question here from Mary Cross, who's a former Irish ambassador indeed and IIEA board member. She says, Professor Walt said that power and influence is shifting towards Asia, and that's been a very clear part of your presentation. She wants to know, what other Asian powers besides China do you see as important in this shift?
Well, almost all of them. Certainly, you know, if you look over a 30 or 40-year period, the rise of South Korea from a country that was at one time had a lower per capita income than North Korea. I think that was true well into the 1960s, and now South Korea is a top 10 economy. Vietnam has had a remarkable run of economic growth, increasingly important. This is the first year in 25 years or so in which the Australian economy didn't grow, and that's directly related to COVID, not to mistakes that the Australians made. And finally, India, although I think it's disappointed a number of analysts with its economic performance, has done far better in the last 10 to 15 years than it had done previously as well. So in a sense, we're seeing not just the spectacular rise of China, but a number of other countries over a 30 or 40-year period. You know, you could throw in Singapore, which has had a remarkable run for a long period of time as well. And all of this has begun to move the overall balance of economic power, from what was once very much a North America and Europe world plus Japan to a world where it's much more evenly distributed. It is not just China, although China is obviously a big part of it.
Steve, just you said either in your speech or elsewhere, you said that it was a combination of the deadly virus, inadequate planning, and incompetent leadership has placed humanity on a new and worrisome path. Just how worried are you? I mean, how worrisome is this path? I mean, is this future, a possible future that you're describing, is it one that we should all be losing a great amount of sleep over?
Well, I'm more concerned than I have been, in most of my life, I guess. I mean, I think the pandemic itself, we will in fact get over. I think there will eventually be some combination of vaccines and medical treatments such that this issue is no longer restricting life in the way it is. I don't anticipate, sort of going back to the way things were anytime soon. I think we will still be adjusting our behavior a year from now. And one thing to think about is, what happens if a year from now we have a vaccine, it's readily available, and it's only 70% effective. It's about as good as a good flu vaccine, which means there's still some considerable risk that if you're in certain circumstances, you could catch a disease that's more virulent or potentially more dangerous than your average flu. That's going to lead people to adjust their behavior in certain ways, and that may be the world we're headed into. I'm much more concerned by a set of political trends in a variety of places, and to be a selfish American nationalist for a moment, especially in my own country, where the toxic nature of our political system now, the fact that we're even talking about the possibility of an election where 30 to 40% of the country will think the election was fraudulent, regardless of what the outcome is, right? That's a very worrisome situation for any democracy to be in, and particularly when it's a democracy that has been as powerful and influential and played such an enormous role in the world. So in a sense, I've been more worried about the political trends inside the United States for the last few years than I've ever been in my life. And I'm hoping that the sort of darkest predictions here turn out not to be true, and that over the next year or two, we can see sort of the reemergence of a somewhat more unified and cohesive America. I think that would be good for the United States, but also be good for the rest of the world. It is actually not healthy to have such a powerful country be so convulsed, so distracted, and so unpredictable, because our politics keeps shifting back and forth so rapidly.
Well, just apropos of that, I mean, a question here from Peter Gunning, who's a former colleague of mine, indeed a former ambassador, and he wants to know, he says, even if we leave aside the US election outcome, is the era of the US as the indispensable power in the world, whether militarily or in terms of values and standards, is that over forever? Is it over for good?
Well, I've never liked the thinking of ourselves as the indispensable power. I think that was Madeleine Albright's mistaken phrase. It exaggerated America's ability to shape events. Certainly the position the United States found itself in the 1990s, where not only were we essentially unchallenged by anyone, on good terms with almost every major power, enjoying a number of years of pretty robust economic growth. I think that that world is not going to come back in my lifetime. That the United States is not going to be in that dominant position as well, and that's because of the rise of China, the partial recovery of Russia, and some other trends as well. But the United States is going to remain extremely influential, and its ability to shape events in particular realms, in particular areas, for good or bad, is still going to be quite profound. I think that requires the United States to be more selective, to decide what issues it's going to care most about, what parts of the world it's going to care most about, and to understand what it is good at doing and what it's not good at doing. Historically, we've been pretty good at deterring major conflict in certain areas. We have not been particularly good at taking over other countries and then running them in a beneficial way. So if we do more of the former and less of the latter, that'd be a good thing. Historically, the United States has been pretty good at bringing groups of mostly like-minded countries together for common purposes. And that was obviously especially true in the Cold War, and not just in security terms, also in economic terms. I think we can still play that role pretty effectively if we choose to do so. But whether we have the wisdom to sort of focus on what our skill set really is and stop making some of the mistakes we've made over the last 20 or 30 years remains to be seen.
Okay, yeah, you've touched